Well, hello everyone. Once you get here and once you join us, why don't you go ahead and let us know that we're here, just so I can have a sense of how many folks are here and a part of this. Jerry is watching. Let's see, it says wave. What happens if I push that? I don't know, Jerry, did you see me waving at all? I wonder. Dana Booth is quick on the ball, has joined us here. Jerry Ford, did you see me do a wave? What did that do when I pushed that? Or maybe that was you waving to me. Maybe that's what it is. I'm assuming we've got a couple of, or perhaps several booths there. Welcome to you guys. When you're here, go ahead and join us. We've got all these people who are coming in with waves. We've got Mona and Larry and Nancy Hibble. And Jerry says, when I did my wave, it didn't show up at all. I'm seeing this fancy little button as folks come in that I've never seen before, and it says wave on it, but I don't know what it does. Maybe one day. I'm going to solve one mystery at a time. I'm going to let you know in just a minute the mystery that I've solved. Mona, good evening to you. Doreen, welcome. Glad to have you here. Lori, we're glad to have you here. And there's some sort of emoji there, clapping hands maybe. Lori, if you guys back home, or are you guys still in West? Anyways, glad to have you with us. Good evening to Doreen. We'll give a little bit more time as folks jump in, and we're going to start with a bonus lesson tonight, and so I want to make sure that as many folks who are able can get that. Welcome to Landy and to Phil and Ruth. Thankful and glad to have each of you guys with us. My story that I'm going to start with in just a moment actually involves Phil and Ruth, so I'm glad that they're here to hear that. Thankful that Lori is home. Welcome to a whole line of Bowers. We've got Jerry Sequel and Jerry Bowers, and we've got the Bullocks checking in here from Cheyenne, Wyoming. We should probably be doing a prize each week for who gets to check in from the furthest away. I could send some sort of gracious prize, I'm sure of it. Terry, thanks for joining us, and it's good to have you with us as well. We're going to start off with a mystery question, and the mystery question is not anything I'm going to verbally say, but I'm going to show you this and see who comes up with the correct answer. So go ahead and use your comment feature if you notice anything about this paper. We will give 6 points to the first person who gets the correct answer. Go ahead and use your comment feature and see if you can answer the question that's written on this piece of paper. Oh, Doreen, I hope that's not right. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yes, possibly there is an upside down 7. The other possibility is I forgot when I started to write a note to myself that this was my paper. And actually, I think that the upside down L is might be a good deception thing. Anybody, see if they can figure out what's interesting about this piece of paper. And I will give you a hint that has nothing to do with the writing of the L or the 7 or whatever that might be. Caleb says a little mark on the paper. Elizabeth says it's a nose. Upside down 7. All right, let me tell you what is actually really interesting about this piece of paper. Assuming I'm right, you can read this. Is that true? Can you read this piece of paper properly? So somebody just confirm with us for just a moment. Hannah says we can read it. Okay. So here's what's interesting about this piece of paper is, yes, Landy, you get a 5-penny prize. The writing is not inverted. Yay. Okay. Thanks to Ken Hostetter and my in-laws, we have just solved one of life's great mysteries. I think it was a couple of weeks ago, Jerry mentioned that while I was doing a class, my mother-in-law asked why I was wearing my wedding ring on my right hand. And every time I've done a Facebook Live class, everything in my office has been switched. And so I know Scott Litton, for example, said, Craig, it really is hard to focus when your door is over your left shoulder when I know the door is really over the right shoulder. Ken Hostetter was giving me an idea about how I could learn to write backwards, taking a Sharpie, writing something, and then I could flip it over and show that to you. And I thought maybe if I Google it, I can find an answer. And so in like 5 minutes, I managed to solve one of life's great mysteries, how to be able to hold up paper. So here's the spiritual lesson that we're going to get out of the fact that I can now hold up a piece of paper and you can read it, which is one of the values of community is that it will help us to see things that we may not even be aware of. I think somebody had mentioned once, and I'd completely forgotten because I just got into my own little bubble of just doing my thing and not really knowing what you guys are seeing. But when you get feedback, you can begin to see what other people see and begin to be aware of what other people are aware of. And that gives you an opportunity to address it. And what if the same were true of our spiritual lives, that we become mirrors to each other and to say, look, this is what you think is being portrayed, but what I'm seeing is actually backwards compared to what you think that you're doing. So that's a free bonus lesson. And so if you just came tonight for a single lesson, you can now take it and run because you have your bonus lesson. And that being one of the importance of community is that we can help to see ourselves there. Since Judy Hostetter just joined us, Judy, I'm going to hold this up and show you. You can, I'm guessing Ken's there. If not, you can report to him that I figured out a way to get my camera to work properly, that people can now read pieces of paper. So I'm really excited about that. So this may be a strange time to answer this question. We're going to finish off our series that we've been doing on walking with God, and we've looked at all these different spiritual temperaments and just different ways that we experience life with God. And so one of the questions I'm going to answer now is, why did we go through this whole series doing that? And one of the reasons is because right now, with all the COVID stuff going on, we are far less church-centric than we typically are. And what I mean by that is that there may have been a day and a time where, whether this is healthy or not, but where somebody would say, look, next time I go to church, it's going to give me what I need, and the next time I'm going to go to church, it's going to give me what I need. But one of the things that at least I recognized whenever we weren't able to meet together is that it is important for each of us to be developing healthy spiritual habits and healthy spiritual disciplines that help us to connect with God. That we should always see the church as a partner in that process, but the church should never be the sole source of our spiritual renewal or our spiritual encouragement or any of those sort of things. And so as we've been introducing these different spiritual temperaments, and as I've been giving these exercise things for us to try, one of the reasons is this recognition that we can depend too much on the church to provide what maybe we need to be learning to provide for ourselves. That was a lesson I learned from one of our teammates in New Guinea. She was talking about how in America, if a person wants, they can just easily get spiritual fast food. They can just show up and somebody can quickly download what they've learned in their studies or in their experiences, and you get a quick, distilling of that lesson. But in New Guinea, where you don't have all those resources, she said it's more like you have to cook from scratch every single meal. And I think that's one of the things that we've been learning over the last few months is sometimes you do have to cook from scratch. And so if you've not done that before, I wanted to be sure that we introduced to some of these different ways of connecting to God and developing a closer walk with God. So let's just do a little bit of memory testing here. Over the last, I guess it's been about 7 weeks, we've introduced 7 different ways that we experience God, or that we connect with God, or that assist us in our walk with God. These are different kind of spiritual temperaments. And if you can think of any of one of those 7 things that we looked at, go ahead and type it out, and we'll see how close we can get to my list of 7. I'm cheating. I have them all printed out in front of me. I'm not sure I could recall them all by memory, but if you can think of or remember one of the class themes that we looked at in terms of ways to connect with God, go ahead and use your comment feature, and we'll see how many of the 7 that we can get. I just realized now that we had 7, which is a very biblical number, so this probably is really a good way to conclude and to end this class, as this is our what we'll call a season finale. Yeah, so we have the first one, and I'm going to write these as we go, is nature. This naturalist approach that is a spiritual activity of beholding creation. Yes, we have also celebration and delight. Celebration and delight. Okay, Mona, we have through the arts. And so we have the arts and the imaginations and the senses. We have caregiving as one of our things there. So we have the naturalist, we have celebration and delight, we have the arts, we have caregiving. What else did we cover here in this class? One of the things that this is a benefit to me is to see what are the things that people remember and what sticks with them, because that, as a teacher, is always good to be aware of what sticks and what does not. If I don't see another comment in a few seconds, I'll start rattling off the answers of the things that we missed. Okay, Jerry mentions asceticism, that act of self-denial. That's actually a really hard word to spell. I bet that's why nobody put asceticism, is they're like, I have no idea how to spell it, which we can do. Yeah, Terry mentioned this idea of changing our normal routine and routes to find something new, which would certainly be this underlying theme that touches on the element of each of these classes. Yeah, we have this notion of kind of this meditation and writing, which kind of falls in this kind of this feeling and sensing spirituality. Feeling and sensing. Okay, so we had Art mentioning the intellect. So using the mind and reason, one of those things in Jerry Bowers or Sequel, also jumping in there with that. So yeah, we had first of all the naturalist. This is a person who wants to leave the formal architecture of the padded pews, of the 4 walls, and gets outside through walking or hiking or sitting on a porch, and a person will really resonate or connect with God in his creation, that the heavens proclaim the handiworks of God. And then we looked at the art, imagination, and the senses, where our encounters with God integrate or involved with all of the full sensory of experiences: touch, taste, sight, hearing, smell. And so this kind of recognition of some people feel most alive in their relationship with God through these artistic means. Then we have asceticism, which is a way of taking up your cross and following Jesus. It's the practice of self-denial. And some people, as they deny themselves certain things, they connect and they resonate to God, who clearly calls for self-denial in their lives. And then we have this concept of celebration, enjoying things in life because of our faith, finding this holy delight and holy joy in the good things that God has given us. Caregiving is another one of the things that we looked at, those who are invigorated by helping and sharing life with others, that when they are involved in loving their neighbors, they are really aware of this connection with God and the work that God's doing in their lives. Then we had feeling and sensing spirituality, which is trying to take the facts that we know, and through experience we connect fact and feeling, so that we don't have a disconnect between what we know and what we feel, but we find that those two things come closer together. And then we have the mind, the intellect, and the thinking. Some people, their hearts are most warmed when they are learning new truths about God, when they are discovering things about God. And so we have all of these 7 pictures, and there certainly is more. And each of these are representative of different kind of spiritual temperaments. They are ways when each of them become pathways to connecting with God, but each individual will be more aware of or resonate more with some of these different pathways. So I'm going to tell a little bit of a parable here as we look at kind of concluding this series and figuring out where do we go from here. This is a parable that I borrowed from a guy named Gary Thomas. And he talks about two women going out on the same day and planting a garden. And so they plant this vegetable garden, but one of the people in this parable, they work the garden regularly. They go out and they put the cages over the tomato plants. They stake out the beans like they're supposed to be. They put netting around the plants that may be more attractive to animals. They're consistent in the weeding, and she's consistent in the watering process. And then the other person, who both of them planted their garden on the same day, the second person, she simply neglects her garden. She plants it, and then the next time she goes out is whenever she goes out to harvest. And so not surprisingly, when harvest day comes, the one who worked constantly with the garden, they find delicious vegetables, and they get to enjoy that bounty. But the other finds rotting fruit, finds weeds all over the place. The little fruit that they do have all these bite marks in them, and it's clear something's been nibbling on them. And that garden is representative of our spiritual lives, where something needs to be done more than just a garden planted, but a garden needs to be tended. And so as we think about our spiritual lives, I think it's so easy to just expect growth to happen, and sometimes even to expect growth to happen without any of our involvement or our participation in it. But hopefully, as we've been going through some of these things, learning new things, but then also practicing new things, we've realized that we bring about part of the growth as we work in partnership with God's Spirit. So I want us to just look at 4 Bible verses that I think kind of highlight this notion or this aspect of our joining in the work that God's doing as we tend the garden of our spiritual lives. So the first is Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 13. Philippians 2, 12 through 13. Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So you see this element here of a calling to work. We're first to work out our salvation, and then we're to work his good pleasure. But in that working, what is it that's working within us? What does Paul say is at work within us? For it is God who is at work within you. And then he goes on to talk about how God enables you to will and to work with his good pleasure. So we are working at tending the garden, and yet God is the one who is at work in it, and he is at work in enabling it. And so we see this notion of kind of a partnership that God gives us and grants us this garden, and yet God works alongside us and enables us and empowers us that we might be able to tend the garden. And as we think about this garden metaphor, a person can plant and tend a garden in all the exact right ways, and sometimes they don't get the fruit they expect. I mean, have you ever had an experience like that? You've said, hey, I don't know why things aren't growing this year, but I've done everything I've done in previous years. And that's where the gardening metaphor is more powerful than, say, some sort of a mathematical or machinery metaphor. A machinery metaphor, like, say, if you take a keyboard and you push A, every single time the letter A is going to go up there. And if you're pushing a button and A is not coming up on the computer, I'd say, well, you're probably really not pushing A. But in the garden, you can do everything right, and sometimes fruits just don't produce in that way. And so we are called in Philippians to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, because God is at work in us, and he's enabling us both to will and to work for his good pleasure. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 15 through 16. 1 Timothy 4, 16 through 15. Put these things into practice. Devote yourselves to them, so that all may see your progress. Pay close attention to yourself and to your teachings. Continue in these things, for in doing this you will save both yourself and your hearers. So we have again this concept of putting something into practice, and that practice leads to or results in a certain kind of progress. It's so easy to play a passive role in our faith. It's so easy to say, well, if God would like to do something, he will do it kind of apart from me. But again, we see this model of practicing and of devoting ourselves to things, and in that it will create some kind of movement or some kind of progress. Let's see, we're going to just look at one more example. This will be Colossians chapter 1, verses 9 through 10. Colossians 1, 9 through 10. For this reason, since we heard of it, we have not ceased praying for you and asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of God's will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so that you may lead lives worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, as you bear fruit in every good work and as you grow in the knowledge of our God. And once again, there is this concept that there is going to be growth, and that a part of that growth is going to be our participation in it. And so we have this kind of this garden metaphor of growing and of nurturing our spiritual lives. And so I just want us to just realize that as we think about the garden of life, the things that we have been learning have been in an effort to help us in that gardening process. So I'm going to use my newfound skill here. If I can get this right and get it close enough to it. See, I have to move everything opposite for you to see it. I just want us to reflect on and see what you think is the answer to this question that Stanley Hauerwas asks. He says, do a person's actions follow from the kind of person he is, or does his character depend on the kind of action he engages in? So what do you think is the answer to that question? Do a person's actions follow from the kind of person he is, or does his character depend on the kind of action he engages in? And the reason I'm holding it up is because I know the question's a little wordy, and so we'll see if anybody wants to. Okay, Gay is going to take the middle road, the same middle road that Doreen takes, with the answer yes. So we have a couple of fence sitters here tonight. Any other thoughts or comments or reflections? Do a person's actions follow? I wonder if it's supposed to be flow. Follow from the kind of person he is, or does his character depend on the kind of action he engages in? We have another yes. We have another yes. All right, we're going to officially say, Lori mentions out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Doreen mentions here, it depends on which one you feed. Okay, and Cynthia mentions that character depends on action. That there certainly is this action there. Karen mentioning also, I was taught actions speak louder than words. So sometimes we think that we are formed into a kind of people based on what we think, based on what we affirm. And that can be a component in the process. That's why we've used this IRS model. We're going to introduce something, so we want our mind to kind of wrestle with something. But then we have these rewirements because we want to be practicing something. And then we have this sharing as we share about that movement and that process. Dana mentioning here that the character comes first. If someone were to ask me, how do I become a certain kind of person? I would likely say certain kinds of actions will form you into a certain kind of person. And let me give an example of how this would work. When I was at Harding School of Theology, one of my friends was talking about running a marathon, and so I insanely decided that I would try to run a marathon. Now, I was not a runner. How does a person become a runner? One of the things I did was I subscribed to a magazine called Runner's World. Does the fact that I subscribe to Runner's World now make me a runner? No, unfortunately. The one thing that's going to make me a runner is getting out and actually running. And so my very first day, I said, I'm going to see how far I can run, and I made it all of a quarter of a mile. So how do we develop something? One of the ways that we develop something is by the consistent practice. So if you think about Jesus says that we should be the kind of a person who is a person who forgives. So this notion of kind of turning to the other cheek. What is the best way to learn to be the kind of a person who turns to the other cheek? I would say that would happen by being a person who turns to the other cheek, that we are going to be formed by those kind of actions and by those kind of behaviors. And so what we want to do here as we kind of conclude, say, let's take these 7 kind of spiritual types, spiritual temperaments, and say, how do we move that into our lives in a way that's helpful? Because we all recognize that there has to be some action that's formative in our lives. And so we're going to go over the kind of the process that we can integrate these things into our lives. And you're going to be impressed. I have typed out steps for you. We have 3 of them, and this is the first. Stop to prayerfully evaluate. One of the things as we look at tending the spiritual garden that I think that we need to recognize is at some point we have to stop for long enough to say, what's good for me? What's right? What needs my attention and what needs my priority? We have a comment here from Donnie. He says, you know them by their fruit, and out of the heart the mouth speaks. So both are correct, yes. And Donnie, you do understand the question. Yeah, both certainly are correct and are elements. We find in Mark chapter 1, verse 35 through 38, in the morning, while it was still very dark, Jesus got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him, and when they found him, they said, everyone is searching for you. And he answered, let us go on to neighboring towns so that I might proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came to do. One of the things that we will see in Jesus' ministry is not just constant engagement, but Jesus will disengage from all of the busyness, and he will disengage from all of the activity so that he can stop for long enough to be sure about where he needs to be heading and what he needs to be focusing on in his life. There's a problem when we constantly keep moving in life and we never kind of stop to say, am I moving in the right direction? There's an old kind of leadership fable that says, the manager tries to figure out how to get people to sharpen their knives faster and to cut down the trees quicker and to cover more mileage in a day, and the leader will climb up on a tree and say, let's make sure we're heading the right direction. I really think it's so important that we stop and we evaluate, how am I using my time? How am I using my resources? So let me just ask you, because it gives us a good sense whether we need to be convinced of this or not. Why is it important for us in our Christian lives to just sometimes make time to stop and evaluate where we're going? So go ahead and use your comment feature and just share if you believe that's important, and if so, why do you think it's important to have times and opportunities where we just push pause, we step back to get another perspective on what we're doing. So go ahead and use the comment feature about why stopping and evaluating is an important aspect in our spiritual lives. Why do we need that 10,000 foot view sometimes of where we're going and of what we're doing? Now, why not just do what we're doing, do it harder and faster and more efficiently? What would be the benefit or the value of evaluating? Okay, yeah, Jerry mentions to be able to consider your faith. Jerry, I think that there's times that we might go through life driven by fear or driven by ego. And unless we consider, is what's really driving this my faith? We may deceive ourselves, just like I mentioned at the beginning of the class, that without feedback from the body, it's so easy to not see things in the way that we need to. Doreen mentioning, to hear the small voice of God. I heard a story this week about a guy who, he and a friend were at, I think it was like a rock concert or something, and in order to be heard, they were yelling at each other. And another friend asked him afterwards, like, why they were so mad at each other. And he said, no, we're not mad. We just had to raise our voices enough to hear. And sometimes what busyness is it's just raising our voices. And people are like, why are you so angry? And all it is we're just trying to be heard. So I think, pulling away from all the noise for long enough to hear God is an important thing to do there. Jerry Ford mentioning that it's easier to see what's happening when you are still. That when we're just chaotically involved, it's just really hard to know what's next, what's right, what's best. Mona mentioning to understand what's really important in life. Yeah, Mona, isn't it so easy to just be investing ourselves in things that just aren't important, and things that, maybe if you think back to your junior high years or your high school years and say, oh, if that thing happened to me, I would just absolutely die. And yet those things that we once held to be so important, maybe they're not so important. And so, this ability to kind of reevaluate what's important. Yeah, and Jerry Segal mentioning to contemplate. That one of the unique aspects of human morality is that we can think about what we should be doing, what we ought to be doing, and we can even realign our lives to that. Yeah, Phil and Ruth are mentioning that sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. That sometimes we can be so blinded by what's right in front of us. And what we really need to do is we really need that perspective that allows us to see things in a different way. Yeah, Bruce mentioning here the same reason we use a map. I think I remember what those are. They're kind of like a GPS, but you have to do all the hard work, right? But yeah, you use a map to say, where am I and where am I going? It's kind of like that Alice in Wonderland phrase where Alice asks, I think it's the rabbit or the hatter or whatever that guy is, how do I get there? And he says, well, it matters very much where you're trying to go. And so the map will help us to kind of connect with where we are and connect with where we're heading. Cliff mentioned doing things intentionally. You need to make sure you're doing the right things. So we don't want to be just kind of blown by every wind of doctrine, nor do we want to be blown by every wind of the latest fad or the latest fashion. That we want to have some intentionality in how we move through life. Yeah, Cynthia mentions that because we're growing persons. So in that fact that we're growing persons, we need to continue to reevaluate that the things that we're investing in are things that are important to us. We may just instinctively or habitually be doing something that was important to a previous version of ourselves. Back when this was important to me, I acted in that way. But now that that's not important, I may need to evaluate my behavior there. We have this scriptural encouragement Gay mentions in 2 Corinthians 13 to examine ourselves. That even as we talk about on a weekly basis, we are reminded and we share in the Lord's Supper that one of the things that we're doing is we're kind of like putting our lives overlaid of the map of Jesus' life and saying, hey, am I living in a way that's reflective of this truth and this reality? Jerry mentioning Psalm 46 verse 10. Let me look that up real quick and read it. Psalm 46 verse 10. And as I'm looking this up, well, I will read it and then I'll do my apology. Be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. And sometimes, Jerry, there is this notion that our stillness is in order to see what's already been there, but it's our stillness that allows us to see that. Now, I'm going to just briefly interrupt with an explanation, which is I have a new carpet rug thing, and I've got it came all rolled up in a little ball, and it's one of those plastic chair cover things. So I've laid it down on the floor to flatten it out and have books on it. And to get this iPad position, I had to put it on that. So if you're seeing extra bounciness, it's because it's on that pad that I'm trying to get flattened out. So I appreciate your patience and understanding with all the ongoing wobbling. Okay, Aaron says, it keeps you from getting stuck in a rut, and it allows you to assess what things we're doing more out of habit and can put... Oh, Aaron, your comment exceeded what my iPad wants to show me. I'm sure whatever Aaron said after can put would probably be the most interesting and profound thing you've ever heard in your life, and you probably can read it, but unfortunately I can't. But I can build off of what Aaron started with, this notion of being stuck in a rut means we're just doing things out of habit, and we're not just stepping back to say, is this important for me to be spending my time and effort in this? Tara is mentioning that we can step back to see other perspectives and put their needs first. It's so easy to be selfish until we stop, and I think that that's really important, that it is so easy to just be thinking about things from our own point of view or from our own perspective, and in that way, if we're not constantly reevaluating it, we may be operating out of a very kind of selfish assumption. Yeah, this notion out of Exodus 14 that what God says to Moses, that the Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still, is recognizing sometimes our busyness is its own expression of a lack of trust. And Aaron's finishing off his comment, I believe it helps us to keep the main things at those moments. Yeah, and as we step out, we can be sure that what we're investing ourselves in really are the most important. Eric mentioning that we tend to think that we're right, but we might be wrong. Until we get a place where we can really evaluate. I wonder sometimes, Eric, what life would be like if it was kind of like the test that you take. I mean, I've had some tests in my life that I felt really good about. Like, man, that's going to be a home run. And I get my score back and I think, whoa, I did really a lot. I did much poorer than I had anticipated. And I think that same sort of thing can happen in our lives, that we do need to be able to kind of, step back and to see. So I want to switch gears here a little bit. Hopefully we have time here. But I just want to ask this question. Okay, what if I'm like, but I'm too busy to stop and to evaluate? So you might be thinking, there's some people out there in the world that have the luxury of stopping and evaluate, but I simply don't. What would you say to, or how would you advise, or what would you want someone to consider who says, I would like to be able to stop and prayerfully evaluate, but I just don't have the time. Maybe maybe I have all of these work commitments that I'm involved in. Maybe I have this horde of children. Maybe I have so many commitments. What's something that what might you advise someone who is just concerned that I don't know where I can find time to even stop and evaluate because my life is so busy and demanding right now? What thoughts might you have? Go ahead and use your comment feature if there's a perspective or a piece of advice you might have for someone who thinks, yeah, maybe some people in this world have the luxury to stop and get perspective, but maybe I should introduce them to me. Okay, so Jerry mentions this idea of priorities. That maybe the reality is that we all have 24 hours, and how that 24 hours is used is very much based on what we do prioritize. Yeah, any other thoughts? Yeah, Lori mentions that sometimes we need to learn to say no, and that if we're not finding time to stop and reflect, the root of that could just be our inability to say no. Yeah, Cynthia mentions that sometimes this busyness, it just fills a void. Sometimes I think that we might be afraid to just get to a place where we really listen, because we might be afraid of what we might hear. Mona mentioning, yeah, this small way. We may not be calling for a 1 week cessation of all work to evaluate life, but it may just start off with saying taking 10 minutes over a lunch hour or something like that, starting small and building from there. Okay, asking ourselves some honest questions like, have I been on Pinterest or Facebook? And some of those kind of common time eaters. So if I'm saying I don't have time for something, it might be good for me to ask, so where is my time going? And I may find that there's actually time there, it's just being squandered or misused. Yeah, we need to be able to choose. Dorian mentions we need to be able to choose our best, yes. And in order to do that, we can stand back, or yeah, some of our time savers. So one of the things that I hope that you'll be able to identify as we've gone through these courses is kind of, what is your spiritual temperament? Each of these are intended to be tools that help us to just discover ways that we connect in our relationship with God. And so for me, I'm a mix of a naturalist and a mind/thinking person. And so what I need to do is to learn to kind of gear my day in such a way that it incorporates these elements that really help me to be aware of my connection with God. Again, this is not to say that God's not always there, but there are things that help me to be more aware of God's presence, and I want to have more of those kinds of things in my life. And so if I'm a naturalist, I want to be sure that I'm finding ways to get outside. As a thinker, I want to be sure that there's ways that I'm studying, or that I'm feeding the mind. And so by stopping and getting a sense of what's important. Now, if you say, I don't really know which of those things are important to me, the best exercise that I would prescribe is something called fills my bucket, empties my bucket. It's just taking a piece of paper. I'll use this as an example. See, life is so much easier when I can do things, and I can't talk and write at the same time. But you just take a piece of paper like this, and you just write, a line down the column, and you say, these are the things that fill me, and these are the things that empty me. And take about 5 minutes and just say, what are some of the activities that fulfill, that are life-giving, and what are the activities that are life-draining? And as you begin to answer some of those sort of things, I think you'll get a really good sense of your spiritual temperament. And then making a conscious effort to make sure that you're engaging in some of those activities that really fill you well. Cliff mentions to do study time, do a time study on yourself and see where you're spending your time. Yeah, so it's valuable to say, if I don't have enough time, then maybe the first question I want to ask is, where is my time being invested or allocated? And then even finding these already possible opportunities. Everybody goes to bed every night, and so maybe you connect that with a time of prayer. And so thanks to Jerry for mentioning that possibility. So step 2, after you stop and prayerfully evaluate, step 2 is to formulate a plan. As we think about tending the garden, one of the things that I think that's important for us to think about is, what do I need to do to be tending the garden of my spiritual life? What things need to be more of a priority? What things need to be less of a priority? What things do I need to start? What things do I need to stop? So Luke chapter 14:28 and following says, "For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build but was not able to finish.' Or what king going out to wage war against another king will not sit down and first consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace." And I think as we think about formulating a plan, that we want to do that with both clarity and specificity. What are the things that I need to do more of, and what are the things that I need to do less of? There's actually this language, I think, in 1 Timothy 6:11. He says, "But as for you, man of God, shun all this." And as he's mentioning that, he's pointing up to everything that's happening in chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. He's saying, shun all this, pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, gentleness. And so there are some things that we need to shun which means I need less of in my life. I need to flee from, I need to get away from, and then there are some things that I need more of in my life. I need to pursue more. Typically, the American answer to this is just the add more phase or element, and that's why the stopping is important, because as we think about how we're going to spend our time, how we're going to tend that spiritual garden, I think it's really important for us to say, what things might I need to shun? What things might I need to avoid? What things might I need to stay away from, because they're not going to contribute in a good way. And so it's not just about saying, here's the things I'm going to pursue, but here's also the things that I'm going to stay away from. And the interesting thing when it comes to our spiritual lives is that the things that we need to shun may be very different for some of us. One of the things that I need to shun is TV. I have the kind of a disposition, if there's a TV on, all I want to do is just sit there and do this. So when Jerry and I, there's certain places where we cannot go on dates, like Buffalo Wild Wings is an example, because there's TVs everywhere. There's nowhere for Jerry to sit me where I can't see a TV. And so we have to go places where if we go somewhere, I'm not looking at the TV because my attention is just gone there. So I think I've mentioned this before. I'm not sure. We don't have any sort of cable or anything like that. And why don't we have cable? It's because of me. And because that's something that I need to shun, because I could probably break a new world record in the most number of hours a person could watch TV for. And so I just think as we look at our spiritual lives, we need to identify, what are these things I need more of, and what are these things that I need less of. And so that comes back to this allocating our time that we've looked at. Maybe sometimes we're just investing our time in things that we actually need to be fleeing from or having less of. Yeah, Eric mentioning the importance of simplifying rather than complicating our lives. Donnie mentions, let me pull this up here. He's mentioning Colossians chapter 3, verse 17. So we'll turn there. Colossians 3:17. Oh, maybe it's 1 through 7, Donnie. Is it 1 through 7? Because my Colossians... Oh, I'm in Thessalonians. My bad. I turned an extra page. 3:17. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. And so if there's something that we're doing that isn't for the will of God or to the will of God, that's something that we may need to give some consideration to. So sometimes the language for this, if you want to Google something, it's called like a rule of life or a life plan, where we just sit down beforehand and we have a sense of saying, what kind of a person do I want to become, and how do I want to use my life energy in that way? And so what things do I need more of? What things do I need less of? And so kind of just come up with a sense of some things that you're wanting to do. And hopefully some of these rewirement practices, you could say, you know what, that's something I need more of. That's something that I found to be a blessing, and I need to create space where there can be more of some of that. And with that, I would recommend, be just clarity and simplicity, rather than just I'm going to pray for 10 minutes. I mean, where am I going to pray for those 10 minutes? I mean, thinking about the environment and the space and some of that, I think is helpful. Okay, yeah, so Cynthia is mentioning that as you think about wound care, sometimes people think more medication is better, but more isn't always better. And so if the answer is always just more, sometimes even more of the same thing, that might be dangerous. It becomes detrimental rather than healing. And so one of the things that we recognize is that we want to kind of look ahead and want to have a sense of what's going to help me tend this garden. And again, what I've done is I've introduced us over the last few weeks to some of these 7 things that help tend people's gardens. Some of them you'll resonate with, and some of them that you won't. But go ahead and say, okay, if I wish I did more of X, what does that look like? When might you do that, and what might it look like for that to be incorporated into your life? And then step 3, I feel like I need drum rolls here. Step 3, have an active start or actively start, but with graciousness. Sometimes we can get so much into this planning stage and phase that, until I come up with the perfect plan for tending my spiritual garden, I don't know what I'll do. But what we want to do is we want to be a people who are practicing things, because the practice itself is formative. The practice itself is a part of what changes us. James offers this warning in James 1:22 and following. But be doers of the word, and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. And he goes on, but I think that's enough to get the sentiment of what we're saying, that primarily or predominantly or fundamentally, the Christian faith is something to be believed, and it's also something to be practiced. It's a life guide, it's a lifestyle, it's a behavior modification strategy in some ways. And so the best way to do that is by doing the kinds of things that the Bible instructs us and teaches us to do. And so James mentions that we should be hearers, not just hearers, but also doers of the word. But we also need to recognize sometimes we can be the harshest critic in our lives. Sometimes in a conversation with someone else, we might be much kinder or much gentler, or say, understand that this is what you're going through. And yet sometimes with ourselves we're not. And that's why I added this sentiment of with graciousness. Like start, but with the realization that we're not going to always get it right, and that's okay. That we are trying to form ourselves into something new, and that as we do that, it will certainly take some time along the way. Donnie is mentioning 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 2. So we will turn over there. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 2. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation. And so we want to be living into that sort of person. Yeah, and Cynthia mentions that once a decision is made, it doesn't mean that it's made in stone, that there's always room for change when needed. And that's where these steps 1, 2, and 3 is not a one time you do step 1, then you do 2, then you do 3, but it's more like a cycle that you get into and you engage in things, and then sometimes you stop and you realize maybe there needs to be a new plan, or there needs to be a new direction. And so I guess my biggest encouragement is that I hope through this class that you've identified some of your spiritual temperaments, and that then you can use that knowledge to help you better align your time in such a way that you're living in such a way that you're aware that you're walking daily with God. And if something's out of place or out of step, then see if there's not a way that we can reconnect or reevaluate in such a way that it will be more meaningful in our relationship with God. Jerry Bowers is mentioning James 1:22. He's got a question mark after that, so we'll see if James 1:22, Hebrews, James. Therefore, rid yourself of all sordidness and rank growth of wickedness, and welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. So there is this powerful word of God that is at work within us. So where do we go from here? This is where we begin to implement and we begin to practice. And again, and we'll finish where we started, which is with this notion that who knows what's going to happen in the near future with COVID-19. Are we going to find ourselves, once again, kind of severed from the church body, at least in person? I don't know. But one of the things that I hope is that we all have these habits and these disciplines, have these practices that we're tending the spiritual garden, that the church plays a role in that, but that we're not so heavily leaning on the church that if that piece kicks out, we have absolutely no practices of our own to sustain our spiritual lives. And Jerry is saying that that's not the right verse, and we'll see if we can track down the one there. But Jerry did get a thumbs up, so it's a good thing that you shared that verse. Let's go ahead and pray together. We'll finish up our class for tonight, and then if folks want to stick around and chat in our virtual lobby, we can do that for a little bit. But let's just pray together. Father, we do want to give the proper care and attention to our spiritual lives. Give us a place and a time and an opportunity to just step back so that we can have the kind of a perspective that you want us to have, that we can devote ourselves to the things that you want to devote us to devote ourselves to. And ultimately through this, we pray that we become more and more aware of the fact that we walk with you, we walk alongside you. So be with us, be in our midst as we seek to grow in a way that recognizes your nearness and your power. And we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Karen, you're most welcome. I'm glad that you joined us. It's good to, I know I can't see you, but at least we can hear from you, and thankful to have you as a part of the class. So did anybody get to do anything fun over the 4th of July weekend? Any interesting things coming up in anyone's life? This is where we hang out in the lobby. If you need to go, you're certainly welcome to go, but if you want to stick around and virtually connect, we'll do that together for just a few minutes until people start to leave and say, this is the most boring thing I've ever encountered. Our family went down to watch the fireworks at the Metro yesterday, and our kids plugged their ears through most all of that. Mona, you're most welcome. I've really enjoyed taking the time and teaching it. I would never have guessed that on Facebook I'd say it's really a cool way to connect with people and to teach, but God's patient and learning new things is that. Well, thank you, Jerry. Appreciate your kind words. Yeah, it's God is constantly calling us upward. There you go. Yeah, Jerry, with all the mention of taking care of our spiritual garden, some of us say, we need to water our gardens, and that's clearly what God does there in Isaiah 5, is he attends well to his garden, and even God can't predict an absolute great outcome there. Jerry Bowers had a McDonald's chicken sandwich. I believe at some point in my life, Jerry, I have also had a McDonald's chicken sandwich. When they first came out with this mobile app thing, they would give you a chicken sandwich for $1 if you wanted one, and so sometimes I would partake of the McDonald's chicken sandwich. Mia shot off some ground-style fireworks. A lot of fun for her, and I saw her today, and it looks like she had all of her fingers, so that's very good. And she was cute to see in church today, trying her best to keep her little handkerchief up, and appreciate her being so conscientious of keeping that on there. Elizabeth Ford says, thank you for the class. Miss Elizabeth, you're most welcome. Typically what I do on Sunday night is once I get home, I get the full report over who was awake and who was asleep in Sunday night's class. But if Elizabeth's saying thank you for the class tonight, maybe she wasn't the one who fell asleep, but we'll see which Ford did that. Did find out that the punks burn, sadly. I don't know, is that pumpkins? We'll have to see what burned. I hope there weren't these like kids who are like neighborhood punks that came by and that you burned them. That really wouldn't be very nice. Jerry, thank you for your kind words. We'll see what's coming up. I guess I'll give you a little bit of a heads up in terms of what's coming, and we'll just do a one-off class next week. Still not 100% what I'm going to do with that, but then following that, we're going to be having a going away for Dustin and Leah. And then following that, we'll be having a congregational meeting. And I think that takes us into the beginning of August. And then we'll start a new series, even just depending on where things are at with our getting together. Okay, Shayla mentions that it's to light fireworks with. That's good to know. But she does have 2 little burns on her leg. Aw, so sad. Jerry Bauer says Walmart has 4-legged chickens on sale. So I'm watching all of the live attenders numbers just drop because everybody's dropping everything they have so that they can go to Walmart right now, Jerry, to buy 4-legged chickens. All right, well, we are down to 15, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Appreciate everybody being a part of the class tonight. And next Sunday night, we'll be here at 5 o'clock doing a class that I'm not 100% sure what we'll be covering. But look forward to seeing you there, and hope everyone has a blessed week. Thanks for being a part of the class tonight.